From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm David Mandel, the library's head of exhibits. On behalf of the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program, opening the library's Baseball Americana exhibition. It was Dr. Hayden who greenlit this project and was instrumental in making it happen, and we are very appreciative of her support. When we began developing Baseball Americana, the team set out to produce an exhibit-based experience that provides meaningful engagement with the library's collections relevant to baseball. We did this with story and design. The storytelling focused on the idea of baseball as community. On any given day when the weather is nice here in the United States, there are boys and girls, men and women playing softball and baseball from Oakland to Omaha, from Albany to Atlanta. The story structure was a broad thematic sweep of history, people, and growing inclusivity. The design riffed off architecture organic to baseball, the grandstand, a public space where people come together. We set out to make an immersive environment that would be a place where the library's visitors can also come together, those with a love of baseball and those who are new to the game, those who already know the library and its extensive collections, and those who are discovering its treasures for the first time. We hope it's a place where the story of baseball as community and the related items on display, the interactive experiences, and design inspire conversations and create enjoyable moments and memories. The best exhibits combine engaging aesthetics with intellectual rigor. That was our goal, and I hope you and all of our visitors feel that it was attained. Exhibitions are collaborative endeavors. I'd like to thank my main co-conspirators in committing this act of visual communication. Our curator, Susan Rayburn, our exhibition directors, Betsy Nam Miller and Cynthia Wayne, our deputy chief of exhibitions and production manager, Karen Worth, our education specialist, Naomi Kokion, Jun Yi, our digital project specialist, and our colleagues in the interpretive programs office and library services. Pure and Applied were our wonderful exhibition designers. Northern Light Productions made our audiovisual pieces. Space Design built and installed our grandstand and graphics, and Colorad our exhibit cases. Lastly, I'd like to thank our content partners and lenders, Major League Baseball, the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, ESPN, and Mr. Hayden Trubitt. Now, please welcome the curator of Baseball Americana, Susan Rayburn, to introduce tonight's featured guests.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you all for coming. The calendar says tomorrow is June 29th, but for the Library of Congress, it will be opening day, as Baseball Americana officially begins its year-long run. I hope you all had a chance to get an advance peek earlier this evening, and that you will all send out to everyone you know copies of the baseball cards you just made of yourselves. Hashtag Baseball Americana. You will probably have noticed a couple themes in the exhibition, including a comparison between baseball then and now, and how the game has fostered a strong sense of community among teammates, fans, neighbors, and of course, baseball stat geeks and stat heads, a group that will find tonight's discussion especially illuminating. There are items in the exhibition that specifically address baseball's ancient and unique obsession with number crunching, whether it's stats on the back of baseball cards, hand-colored hitting charts that Whitey Herzog produced by the thousands, a game of Stratomatic, or the use of Sabermetrics. A newspaper broadside from 1859 covering the first intercollegiate baseball game includes an early example of a box score before things got so much more detailed. Taking stats to an extreme, we display a book illustrating Alan Roth's mind-numbing, seemingly endless formula that reduced a player's overall performance to a single number. Roth anticipated the importance of OBP. I've been looking at a lot of acronyms lately. On-base percentage, a concept that plays a central role in Moneyball. It all used to be so simple. Batting average, home runs, runs batted in. The acronyms BA, HR, RBI were easily understood by those who had only a passing acquaintance with the game or mathematics. Today, of course, nobody has just a batting average. They have an entire slash line. BA/OBP/SLG. And if you have slash marks, you also probably have whips. That's walks and hits per innings pitched. Slashes and whips obviously would lead to WAR, that is, wins above replacement. Meanwhile, Major League Baseball's StatCast calculates new forms of data, such as average launch angle and exit velocity. For most fans and the general public, the concept of what is now known as sabermetrics, reinterpreting data and inventing complex, comprehensive methods for calculating player performance, first entered the national consciousness with the 2003 publication of the eye-opening and best-selling book, Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game by Michael Lewis, and the subsequent film released in 2011. Moneyball represents an important milestone in the crowded field of excellent baseball literature. As many of you here know, the book chronicled the efforts of Oakland A's general manager Billy Beane to build a strong team with a weak budget by using advanced forms of statistical analysis to identify worthwhile players who were overlooked using conventional scouting methods. Moneyball not only looked back on what happened in Oakland, but it prompted an entire sport to look forward to what this new approach offered. The Library of Congress currently has more than 9,000 baseball books, and few have had such an immediate and resounding effect as Moneyball. It influenced the way teams evaluated players and built rosters, and it prompted front offices to add science and technology to the hunches and gut instincts of veteran scouts. More than a sports book, Moneyball is also a book about business and success, finding an edge amid opportunities that others miss. In celebrating the exhibition opening, the Library of Congress is very pleased to have with us tonight Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball, and pioneering baseball analyst Rob Neyer. In addition to Moneyball, Michael Lewis is the author of several other popular works that have also made it to the big screen, including The Big Short, about the financial crisis that began in 2008, and The Blind Side, which followed a high school football lineman's journey from hardship to success. His latest book is The Undoing Project, which examines how we make decisions. Rob Neyer is a former senior baseball editor for Fox Sports, an analyst for ESPN, and a research assistant to the baseball stats guru Bill James. He is the author of several baseball books, including the forthcoming Powerball, Anatomy of the Modern Baseball Game. He was also just recently named the commissioner of the Summer Collegiate West Coast League. To get into a Moneyball frame of mind, we've got a clip from the film. Take a look.
Let's just jump right into this thing.
Let's do it.
We've already been introduced, and we all know what this is about, so let's just talk about Moneyball. I met Michael back in the summer of 2002. Oddly, I had read one of his books and enjoyed it, but forgot his name. So when he introduced himself, I had no idea who he was. But he told me he was writing this book about baseball and focusing on the A's, and we talked. And it wasn't until the book came out, and he shared with me the manuscript, but it wasn't until the book came out that we realized we had a phenomenon on our hands. But I wanted to first ask, what led you to start hanging around the Oakland Coliseum in 2002?
Well, there's a backstory, and the backstory was I'd followed my wife to California. Tabitha had a fellowship at Stanford. And I had always, as a little kid, been a fan of the A's. And I'd been a fan of the A's because my high school baseball coach had come to us from A's spring training, where he'd been beat out for the starting catcher job by Gene Tennis. And decided that the minor leagues were no longer for him. He was from New Orleans. His name was Billy Fitzgerald. And he showed up with Gene Tennis's mitt and an incredibly persuasive rap that I was the next catfish hunter. And the only thing I had in common with Catfish Hunter was that I didn't have a fastball. But he turned this into like a positive attribute. Just like him, you don't have a fastball. And so the A's I started following them from then. So we're now in the A's backyard. And I started watching games on TV again for the first time. And this was late 90s, when salaries are exploding. And I started to pay attention to the money on the field because salaries were exploding. And I was particularly interested in the beginning with the question of whether there was kind of class warfare within teams. The left fielder was being paid $6 million a year, and the right fielder was making $150 grand. And I wondered how pissed off the right fielder was when the left fielder dropped a fly ball. And I was watching for that. I was seeing, are they starting to hate each other? Is the inequality in baseball expressing itself in the team dynamics? And that's why I started paying attention. And then it dawned, I started to realize that these payrolls are radically different from each other, and that the A's had no money, and they were playing against these teams with all this money. And that made me curious, because they were doing real well. How could you, if the market for baseball players was efficient, the team with the most money should just buy all the best players and win all the games? That seemed to be a question worth trying to answer. And then two things happened. I met a man named Doug Pappas, who died not long after, but who was part of the Society for American Baseball Research. And he sat me down and he showed me analysis he had done that showed just how extraordinary it was what the A's were doing with their money. And
Marginal wins, right?
That's right. It was dollars per win. Right. And they were winning so many more games per dollar than every other team that if it had been a normal industry, they would have just acquired all the other teams and run them too. They were clearly running their team. It looked like they were in a different business. So that caused me to call Billy Beane, who was at the time at spring training in 2002. And I said, I'm thinking about writing maybe a little something about this. I'm curious about it. I thought it was going to be maybe a magazine piece. And I flew out to spend time with him. And after a day, I thought, oh my God, this is big. I don't know how big, and I didn't know what it was. I'd never written a sports book. So I didn't even think to myself at first that there would be an interest in me writing on the subject. So it took some time before the storm gathered and I realized exactly what this was, maybe 6 or 7 weeks. But it was 6 or 7 weeks of really kind of immersing myself in the organization. So that's the beginning of it.
And was there, and we've talked about your process before, you usually typically start off working, thinking with luck, this is a magazine piece. And with more luck, or a great story, it's more than that. Do you remember a moment or moments when you thought, oh, this actually is a book, this is my next 6 or 8 months?
Absolutely. So I remember it vividly because I took action. I had not told anybody I was doing this except my editor at the New York Times Magazine, who was faintly interested, but he was humoring me. And it had become clear that yes, they're doing things differently than everybody else. Yes, the person who's running this team is thinking about his players differently than the other organizations are. But it wasn't until there was a night, I decided, so they were conducting what amounted to be a science experiment in baseball. And the lab rats were the players. And I remember asking Billy Beane, what do the players think about this experiment? And he said, we don't tell them, it would only confuse them. He said, but you got a first baseman who's never played first base, you got a leadoff hitter who's slow, you're using people in all kinds of strange ways, and you don't explain it? He goes, and he said, don't explain it. Now, what I found just generally in my writing life, that it's easier to insinuate myself into a world if I can add some value. So of course, the first thing I did was run over to the clubhouse and start telling players about what I learned from the front office. And they were like, you're shitting me. Really? That's why I'm playing first base? To tell me more. And so at the end of what I was started to do is at the end of after every game, I'd meet with one player and tell him what I knew. And then get kind of feel for who these people were. Because I was already thinking, who are the characters in this story? And I was already thinking, it's the hitter who's the most unlikely, that people don't appreciate, and it's the pitcher who's most unlikely, who people don't appreciate. But I wasn't sure who those were. And I was sitting in the clubhouse after the game and waiting for a player to come to talk to me. And I looked up, and then I was seeing all these naked bodies. It was the first time I'd seen the Oakland A's naked. and it was such an unpleasant sight. It was repulsive that a baseball uniform, I mean, it really is a business suit for an athlete. It hides all the problems. And there were guys with fat ankles. There was guys, I mean, they just didn't look good. And I went to the A's. I went over to back to the front office that night, and found Paul DePodesta. And I said, I just saw your guys naked. And I said, if you line, and I said, it was such a strange sight that I thought to myself, if you line all those naked bodies up against a wall and ask anybody what they did for a living, nobody would guess professional athlete. And he says, you kind of stumble on part of our story. And the story is we're in the market for players who the market misvalues in some way. And one of the chief sources of misvaluation is physical appearance. Right. A good-looking player will be overvalued, and an ugly player will be undervalued. A player who doesn't look the part will often be an opportunity for us because we can detect his value with statistics. And I remember driving home from the Coliseum that night and thinking, wow, it's not a baseball story. It's a story about the way markets misvalue people. Forget that it's a sport. Imagine this is just a business. You've got employees on the field who've been doing basically the same thing for a century, with statistics attached to every move they make on the job, with millions of people watching them while they work. And all those people think they're experts on valuing them. If that person can be misvalued by the market, who can't be? It's a story of women in the workplace. It's a story of Jackie Robinson. It's a story, that there was something universal about this, about the way people get misjudged. And I went home, and I wrote my editor at W.W. Norton, my publisher, Starr Lawrence, who's been my editor since my very first book. I said, I've got bad news and worse news. I said, the bad news is the reason you haven't heard from me for the last 6 or 7 weeks is I've been kind of marinating in the Oakland clubhouse. And I'm going to write a book about baseball. And it's going to be called Moneyball. And I said, and the worst news is, it's just the first of 2 books about baseball. And the only reason I'm writing Moneyball is so I can write the second book. And the second book is going to be called Underdogs. And it's going to be about the people they were about to draft players in the draft. And they were going to turn that into a science experiment. And I thought I was going to write a second book about that. And he called me up the next day. He said, go for it. And so that was the moment it started.
So I wasn't going to bring that up, but since you did, 2 related questions. One is, the next big moment was when somebody told you this book is exploding and you're going to have a huge bestseller on your hands. Do you remember that moment?
So I'd already had a few, and so it wasn't new. No. I mean that sounded differently than I intended.
This one was different.
I remember. I think it went to #1 on the bestseller list, and almost right away. And what I remember from the memories I have of the publication of the book are not about sales. My memories are about the controversy. It was so loud and angry, and that's what I followed. And my most vivid memory is with my subjects I have a rule, and every writer should have this rule. I think you're not allowed to see it until it comes out. I don't want your fingerprints all over my prose, and I'm going to do my best to get everything right and check things with you, but you're not going to get to read the thing until everybody can read the thing. And Billy Beane had got his copy of the book, and it was not a hardback yet. It was a galley, but it was a week before it was going to come out. It was that kind of thing. And it was now a year later. It was spring training of 2003. And I remember sitting in my office floor talking to him. He calls, and he's my first inside baseball reader. And he's upset. I mean, he's really upset. But he's not not exactly directing at me, but he's incoherent on the phone. And he's just upset. I read this thing, and God, this thing, and this is not making any sense. I said, Billy, stop. You're obviously upset. What are you upset about? And at that point, I had I was feeling a little guilty because I thought, well, I'm going to destroy his business. That what I've done is revealed his secrets. I've done my best. And everybody's going to read it, and there's no longer going to be these inefficiencies to exploit because what they're doing makes so much sense. And he says, not that, he says, you don't understand. You have me saying all the time.
And my mother is going to read this book.
And my mother's going to read this book. And I said, you do say all the time. And he said, you don't know my mother. He said, my mother's going to be, and I said, you're not serious, right? You're upset because your mother's going to read it and she's going to see you have, and he said, yeah. And I said, I'm so relieved. I thought you were going to be upset because I just destroyed your entire business. And there's this long pause at the end of the line. He says, you don't think anybody in baseball is going to read your book. and Billy, there was a line that came out of his mouth once, you can't be too stupid to play baseball. And he said, he then explained, he said, you don't understand, we've been doing this for the last 6 or 7 years. It's been obvious to anybody who wanted to pay attention that we were more efficient than anybody else. A book isn't going to make any difference. And I remember following that. So my memory or response to the publication wasn't, oh, this thing is selling so well. It was selling not quite as well as one of my other books and a little better than the other one. And it seemed to be doing fine, but it was all these baseball people angrily not reading my book. Joe Morgan, I couldn't turn on ESPN. I could not turn on that television without hearing someone talk about the book. And that went on for a while. And usually it wasn't spoken of in flattering tones. Everybody, to the extent, they talked about Moneyball the way people in Oklahoma talk about climate change. That it's a controversial subject at best. And actually, if we weren't on air, we didn't have to be polite about it, we would damn everything about it. And so that was the tone of it all. And that was preposterous to me, and I knew they were going to lose. Evolution was going to take care of the problem. But it was an odd, not until I published a book, Flash Boys, did I have a similar sort of experience where a whole industry was angry. And that was my memory of it. And that it was going to be an influential book. Well, Billy had told me that no one in baseball was going to read it, and they seemed determined not to. But what happened was curious. What happened was my other audience kicked in, rich people. And like the head of Goldman Sachs called the owner of the New York Mets and said, you fool. You have any idea what these people who are running your organization are doing with your money? And that conversation happened with owners and their rich friends a lot. And that's where the pressure came for change. The owners started saying, oh my God. And I've had a number of young people say, I got my job because of you.
Well, and I think baseball would look much different without the book.
You think so?
I do.
I'm not sure I agree. It would have been slower, but that's it.
Yes, slower, but what I mean is in a very specific way. There are lots of people who have jobs in baseball who wouldn't without the book. And most recently, you can draw a direct line between the book and the Houston Astros winning the World Series because Jeff Luhnow, who built that team,
that's how he got his job.
He wouldn't have ever been considered for a job in baseball unless the Cardinals owner's son or son-in-law hadn't read the book. So I guess I'm wondering, I'm sure you knew that, what it was like to see the Astros, because that's sort of the most direct link between the book and a team actually winning World Series.
No, the Boston Red Sox.
But Theo worked for the Red Sox before the book came out.
Yeah, but Theo wouldn't have gotten his job without the book.
He got the job before the book came out.
No, he didn't. He didn't get the job before. If he got the job before the book came out, it was this.
He was hired in 2002.
No, he wasn't. But this is what happened. So while I was working on the book, I went and reported in other organizations, And one of the other organizations I went and reported in was the Boston Red Sox. And John Henry had bought the Red Sox a couple of years before. And I told him what I was up to. And he said, please come see me. I flew out to Boston and we went to lunch and he said, what do I have to do to get you not to write this book? And I said, why? He says, because we are going to do this in some way. And we've caught on to what the A's are doing. And I said, well, I'm writing the book. He said, more or less, how do I hire Billy Beane to be the general manager of the Red Sox? And I found myself in this weird conversation where I was in between Henry and Billy Beane talking terms. And it ended with Billy briefly accepting the job at the Red Sox and then walking away because he was uncomfortable with other people there or for whatever reason. And Henry then said, who do I hire? And Billy said, hire Theo. So if that happened, if it happened after the book was, or before the book was published, it was just because I was talking to Theo, who was a minion at the Red Sox in the year I was working at
I think Theo was hired as GM that fall, after the season of 2002.
After 2002.
Right.
All right. So it's possible, you're right, it's possible. But
you can take credit for as many championships as you want.
Billy, actually, the Oakland A's can take credit for that because the reason Henry had noticed what I had noticed. So the movement was happening.
He'd hired Bill James.
He'd hired Bill.
A few months before, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep. All right. Well, so you just defeated your own argument. I said that my first response was I think baseball would be kind of where it is now, but it would have moved a little more slowly. And you say all these things changed because of it.
What I think is that the movement would be
here's the counterfactual. All right, you're right. You're right in this sense. The Boston Red Sox were going to do this in some form or other. And they were going to win the World Series because of it. When they won the World Series, everybody would have imitated them.
Right.
And Theo and John Henry would have gotten all the credit for having revolutionized baseball. And no one would know who Billy Beane is. That's probably the counterfactual.
And I think the movement would be roughly the same, a little slower, but every World Series would be different. If you think about the cascade of events when you have all the hirings and team, the world would look different.
Imagine if your parents.
Who won and lost.
Imagine if your parents had never met.
That's right.
That would have changed the world. That would have changed the world.
Well, before I forget, I do need to ask, since you brought it up, whatever happened to underdogs?
Moneyball ate it. The response was so loud that the other things I was going to do, everybody else was doing it.
But you worked on it.
I worked
we went to Sacramento and saw a game.
I spent 3 years roaming the minor leagues with these players. I was in uniform for the Midland Rockhounds during games. I shagged fly balls before the games with the players. I was all over the minor leagues, and I could never quite figure out how to tell the story. First, there were 20 main characters, and then all the think work that was going to be in it. It just felt like Moneyball there was just too much noise around Moneyball. So eventually, I walked. But interestingly, what happened is my wife, Tabitha, is a professional photographer, mainly art photographer. But she tagged along and started taking pictures of these players who were drafted. And she followed them for 15 years. And she's published a book called Fantasy Life, which did real well last year, where it's the photographs of these players over time. And this, to me, is like a watershed moment in our marriage. Because when I met her, the night I met her in Seattle, 1996, the night before, she'd been asked to throw out a first pitch at a Seattle Mariners game. And I was seeing her the night after she'd been invited to do it. She was a celebrity on MTV. And I said, well, what was it like? And she said, oh, I didn't do it. And I said, why didn't you do it? And she said, I didn't want to get hurt. I said, wait, why are you going to get hurt? She goes, they hit it, right? and that was, that I have taken that woman from where she is to the point where she is publishing famous books about baseball is a great, great triumph.
So when you were young, playing baseball for Billy Fitzgerald, Coach Fitz, there's a book about Coach Fitz.
Called Coach.
And you were pitching. What did that teach you about baseball, that experience? What did Coach Fitz teach you? How does that experience show up in Moneyball, if it does, and more broadly in your work in general?
So it leads me, the big thing, so after Moneyball comes out, all of a sudden I'm allowed to write about sports. And the New York Times editor, who was faintly interested in the beginning of Moneyball, is extremely interested when I mention my high school baseball coach. And he's interested for the same reason I'm interested, is that the idea was describe the power a teacher can have in a kid's life. And that to this day, when I find myself in high stress, high pressure situations, I can hear Billy Fitzgerald's voice, and it gives me strength. And the things he put me through gives me strength. And he used the sport of baseball, probably, he didn't use it, I mean, he was a great coach and he won a lot of games. He was more of a basketball coach than he was a baseball coach, but he was a really intense person, and he used the trope about baseball is that it's a game of failure, right? And it is a game of failure. It's where it's an individual game masquerading as a team game. There are lots of one-on-one encounters where you're in the spotlight and you are likely to fail, and the failure is going to be very public. He used that to teach kids how to come back from failure, and it was a rocky experience at times, but it was a great experience. I had found out, this was in 2003 or 4, that a bunch of the former players for this man were raising the money to name the gym at the Isidore Newman School in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I'd gone, for the coach. And they were having no trouble raising the money from both the former players and the parents, because he had had this profound effect on lots of people, not just me. I mean, he turned around my life in a lot of ways. He, at the same time, was about to be fired by the school because a handful of parents of his current players thought that he was too hard on the kids. And he was he had mellowed by so much. When I went back and started talking to these players and told them some of the things we had done, their jaws were on the floor. I started calling former players. Peyton Manning and Eli Manning both played for him. They went to the school. And Peyton Manning said, to this day, I think of Coach Fitz when I'm in huddle. He says, to this day, that he's in my head. And this is playing baseball and basketball for him, not football. So I thought, what's happened? Coach Fitz became an excuse to write about something that's happened in the society. How hard it is for a teacher who is demanding to work his magic. Because the parental fear, life's just become too front-end loaded. Failure when you're 13 is all of a sudden too fraught, or when you're 16. So the parents, in some cases, are just interfering in a process that really should happen because they're afraid what happens to their child if they aren't on the all-district team or whatever, or they aren't playing shortstop, or they're on the bench. And so that's what that story was about. How he leads me to Moneyball is, well, I would never be writing about baseball if I hadn't played, but I'd played before I met him, and I probably would have, I don't know, might have played even if he wasn't there, though he was one of the chief attractions for playing at the school. But there's something I said a couple times in interviews, and I was ridiculed for because I pitched 2 innings at Princeton my freshman year. That was the extent of my college career. But I was recruited, and it got me into college, no question. The coach put me on the list because my high school stats were gaudy, but they were gaudy without a fastball. And because I had a really good curveball. And he taught me how to, he turned me into a Moneyball pitcher, basically. Never walked anybody, never hit anybody. He gave me a feel for the game, that when I hit the Oakland A's, and they're taking people who don't look right, don't have the obvious attributes. I remember that, because I was one of those, as a player, I was one of those players. So in that way, it probably made me a bit receptive to the story I was hearing. Mm-hmm. I, too, was undervalued. Now, so and I think a lot of people feel that way, right? And I think the way the book resonated, it resonated at first because, oh, there's this controversy in baseball. And second, because a lot of people read it and said, I feel that way some. I feel like Scott Hatterberg.
Right. So you get your 2 innings at Princeton, then you've got a long stretch where you're not really immersed in baseball, I'm guessing, at least as a player, obviously. But then, 20-some years later, your daughter starts playing when she's, your oldest daughter when she's 6, is that right?
Yeah, my wife.
For the last 12 years now, you've
so I've been coaching. I've got my children. I have a 19, a 16, and an 11-year-old, 2 girls and a boy, and each of their athletic careers has already cost me a book. So I've the sheer amount of time that I've devoted to the lives, the athletic careers of my children, and I'm dead serious. I mean, tomorrow morning I'm going to get on a plane and go to Boulder, Colorado, where at this moment my 16-year-old is playing a team from New Mexico in a 16 and under softball tournament. She's big time, so I ended up in Berkeley, California, where I live, first coaching my oldest child when she was 6, all the way to the age of 14, and then she outgrew me. And then the second daughter, the same way. I'm still coaching my son. I'm his baseball coach and his basketball coach. I ended up, the funny role was, if the kids are good in the recreational league, there are 300 or 400 girls or a couple hundred girls in the recreational league, and the ones who are ambitious and committed and all the rest move on to kind of an all-star team, these travel teams, starting at the age of 8. And the travel teams, I ran. The minute my eldest got to the age, she was good enough, they said, will you be the commissioner? So I was the commissioner of the Berkeley competitive travel teams. Now, the Berkeley Recreational League was founded by a moral philosopher at the University of California, Berkeley, 35 years ago. It's a wonderful league. The first line of the founding document is, the purpose of children's sports is the moral education of the parents. And the league is run so that if you win too much as a coach, you're not asked to coach the next year. They gun for, like you're gunning for a 500 record. That's the perfect season. And of course, the strikeouts are applauded. No one remembers who won and all the rest. And it is as warm and fuzzy an experience, a competitive athletic experience as you can have it. So now these little girls from Berkeley, these little liberals from Berkeley, California, get on this travel team, and they go over the hill and have to play Republicans. And it was like taking these small furry creatures who come from an island without predators, and letting them loose in, like, you know, in a safari, and with lions chasing.
And how long did it take them to learn?
It was an incredible process because they had both experiences. They realized there were 2 roles. There was this role where you're supposed to be just collaborative and nice, and then there's a role where you're supposed to slit the throat of the person you're playing. And they learned how. It usually took the kids a couple of years. So Dixie, who's my 16-year-old, when she was 8 on the 10 and under team, they were like 2 and 24. And when she was 10, they were #1 in the country. So that's how long it took. And it was, even little liberals, there's a political lesson in this. Even sweet-natured liberals, if you beat them up long enough, get tough and learn how to fight. So that my role, I've now, a year and a half ago, stepped down from that role, but I ran that for 5 or 6 years, and it ate up a big chunk of my life, and it was totally fascinating, and one day I'm going to write a book about it.
So I have 2 more questions. The first one, quickly, please. Do you think Moneyball would have worked, would have resonated the way it did, would have been essentially one of the best-selling baseball books for 15-plus years running now, if it had been a different sport? Could you have done Moneyball with football or basketball?
I remember when The Blind Side came out, nobody bought it. That's when I realized how grateful I should be to baseball for creating readers. because football doesn't. I mean, there is no safer place for a book to be than a football stadium. No one's going to pick it up. No one's going to open it. No one's going to ask what's in it. 50,000 people will walk by that book in a football stadium, and nobody will think twice about it. Whereas you put a book in a baseball stadium, and people, a ballpark, people will pick it up and kind of look at it. If it had been about football, it wouldn't have worked. Any other sport. So I think the literary dimensions, that there is an overlap between literature and the sport. That there's a built-in readership for virtually anything written about baseball was the kindling that started the fire. Without it, I don't think it would have gone anywhere.
So a very quick story. I was at the press junket for the Moneyball movie.
I remember.
Which was in 2011.
I was in the press junket too.
You were in the room?
Yeah, I'm kind of. I
was in the front of the theater in Oakland, and I have this very distinct memory of sitting there as the movie's the first few minutes and having a continuing wave of emotion, because it felt like sort of my life was up there, because a lot of it had been in your book, not my personal life, but my professional life and my passion. And what I was going to ask you was what it was like for you to see that up on the screen the first time and so well wrought. But then you reminded me that it wasn't your first go-around. Blindside had come out.
Right.
Maybe the better question, the more relevant question is, what did it feel like when you were sitting in the theater for the first time watching The Blind Side and seeing your words, sometimes your exact words, being spoken by these people?
Right. I went to The Blind Side. The first time I saw The Blind Side was at a benefit for Goodwill. They released the movie a couple of days earlier to Goodwill so they could show it in San Francisco. And the idea was I was going to go watch it with 300 grandees, and then afterwards I was going to get up and talk about how I felt about the movie. And I brought Tabitha with me, and we were sitting there, and in the middle of it, I leaned over and I said, I don't know if I like this. And she said, do not say that. And then as I was watching it, I was laughing out loud and I cried. And how often does that happen in a movie? Not often. And I realized afterwards, I was quite moved by that. It was actually kind of impressive what they did. And what I'd been doing up to the point when I turned to my wife and said, I don't know if I like this, is every time something was really working, I was saying, I did that. Yeah. They didn't screw that up. And then if I thought something didn't work, or maybe it just wasn't from me, I was saying, that's not working. That's his fault. And so I was taking credit for everything that was working and not taking any blame for what wasn't. And then once I got through that, since then, by the time of The Big Short, I watch them I don't really watch them in a proprietary way. I really do just kind of watch the movie and the only concern I have is that I've been so enthusiastic about all of them that when I first see it and I feel the enthusiasm, I felt with Moneyball and I felt with The Big Short, that I'm only enthusiastic because it's a movie about my book and nobody else is going to like this.
And then they all get nominated for Best Picture.
It's been incredibly lucky, right? The talent that's been attracted to it has been fantastic.
Well, and the Moneyball movie in particular was what a tale. You could write a book just about the making of the movie because there were so many false starts. Famously, it was shut down. I think it was the day before they were supposed to start filming, and you were supposed to get your check.
Yes, and I was in L.A., and I was supposed to go have dinner at Brad Pitt's house with my daughter, who was with me, and that never happened. It just shut down. But that was the whole thing. That whole story was my memory. So they were bumping along with the drama, alongside the drama of the making of the Moneyball movie, was the drama of Billy Bean's response to the making of the Moneyball movie, because he was so upset about the book, he never quite he got over it after his mother was actually furious, and actually furious with me, and I'm not kidding you. I took her to dinner in San Diego and tried to charm her and had no luck, but his attitude towards the movie right from the beginning was, look, this book has created this huge noise in my life. I never wanted it. He didn't know the book was about him until he read it. And I disguised my intentions well enough. And that he said, why on earth would I let anybody make a movie? That's like 10 times the trouble. And I had said to him right from the beginning, I said, Billy, you don't understand. They never make the movie. They'll give you some money for your rights. They'll go pretend like they're going to make the movie, and then the movie won't get made. And he made me list for him all the times this had happened to me. And it had happened a dozen times, not just with books, but magazine articles. I said, Hollywood is fantastic. You throw your manuscript in, they throw this money out, and you run away as fast as possible, and they never bother you again. They just give you free money for nothing. And when I told him what I'd been paid for various things, he goes, huh. And he went and slept on it. He came back and he said, I'm gonna do this. He said, this is great. And so he got a check for an 18-month option on his life rights. And then 18 months later, he calls and he says, guess what? I got another check. And he said, and then like, this happened 3 or 4 times. And each time he'd call and he'd say, this is genius. They're not making the movie. And then one day he calls and he says, you bastard. He says, Brad Pitt just called me and he wants to come over to my house. And the babysitter's wearing a dress and my wife is putting on makeup. And then he proceeds to be genuinely irritated with me for having misled him into thinking that no movie would ever get made, right through the making of the movie, to the point where they've been shooting for 3 months, and Billy has created this socially awkward situation where, yes, he's let Brad Pitt come to his house once, but he's been invited to the set over and over, and he won't go. They're filming in the Oakland Coliseum, these beautiful night scenes where they've recreated a game between the Royals and the A's, and they've got body doubles of 50 players, and they've got 8,000 people in the stands that they're moving around so the place looks full, and everybody's there, and Billy won't go. And so they call me, and they say, could you please just get Billy down to the set? I mean, everybody just feels like we don't want him saying how much he hates us all at the end of it, and it won't be an unpleasant experience for him, and blah, blah, blah. So I called Billy and said, Billy, I haven't been to the set, but I'm going to come out, and I'm going to go, and you should just come down and see. And he says, you're going to be there? I said, yeah. You promise you're going to be there, he says. I said, I'll be there. So Child Dixie, softball player who in Boulder, Colorado right now, and I, after one of her games, go out to the Oakland Coliseum. We roll in, and Brad Pitt has just finished filming one of his moody scenes where he's roaming back and forth in the middle of an empty stadium. And we walk out, and at this point I know him, and he comes running over to say hello. And he gets down on one knee and starts talking to Dixie, who's then 9 or 10 or whatever she is, and I leave them alone. And Billy comes walking in from another place. I go talk to Billy. And as I get to Billy, Dixie comes running over, grabs my leg like she's terrified, and says, who is that weird old guy? And she's standing there, and Billy and I are talking, and while Billy and I are talking, and he's trying to, he's putting in an appearance on the set and not wanting, he's about to, turn and leave. And a production assistant comes running over, and he's got the headphone on, he's got a notepad, and there's a book inside the notepad. And he comes running over just dewy-eyed and gushing, and he says, Mr. Bean, please, will you sign your book for me? Please. And Billy says, it's not my book. He wrote the book. And he says, no, Bean, I want you to sign my book. It's your book. And he's so fawning, it's really kind of awkward, uncomfortable, that Billy goes, okay. Now, what you need to know for what happens next is that there were 2 Billy Beans who played professional baseball, and they actually played in the same outfield, I think on the Twins.
Toledo Mud Hens.
What's that?
They played for the Toledo Mud Hens together.
And really?
Yep.
They played for the Twins and for the Tigers.
Right.
Right.
In the minors, they were in the same.
I didn't realize that.
For a lot of
in the big leagues, they were in the same. And the other Billy Bean spells his name without an E on the end. But the other Billy Bean had come out of the closet and written a book about the experience of being a professional baseball player coming out of the closet. You know what it's called? It's hitting from the other side of the plate. It's like one of the, it's like, so the young man, production, flips open his binder, and there's the other Billy Bean's book. Now, there is no right answer for my Billy Bean in that moment. There's just no right answer. And I look over, and Brad Pitt is sitting in one of the A's dugouts, rolling around laughing. He had orchestrated the entire thing. And the reason I had been implored to bring Billy to the set was so he could play this joke he'd been thinking about obviously for like 6 months. It was just perfect. It was perfect.
That's great. Well, we have run a little long, but I think that story was worth it. We do have time for a few questions. I will choose people. Please keep them brief. First one's always the hardest.
We've got microphones on both sides of the aisle here.
Hi, so can you hear me? I saw you last year at the book festival, and you had mentioned that you're working on a project, if memory serves, about the transition of the current administration. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about that project, how it's going now, and if it's damaging to the current administration, please hurry up and publish it.
So the book comes out October 2nd. It's called The Fifth Risk. It's not quite finished. The sixth risk is that I don't finish it. But it's not due till August 1st, so there's some time. It's basically done. And it started as a series in Vanity Fair, and the premise in the beginning was, well, I was astonished to learn, actually, that by law, that the outgoing administration is required to make all these elaborate preparations for the transition. And as they should, because much of what the federal government does is not ideological at all, and they're just like, here's what we're working on, or here are the problems, or here are the risks. And the thousands of people in the federal government had spent many, many months generating these briefings and briefing documents, and you could get just about the best course in how the government works ever created by just going and listening to the briefings. And that the Trump transition the Trump team had not gotten any of them. Basically, they not showed up for the transition. And because Trump had fired them all. What people who were in place, who we were apparently a little bit aware of, fired them all right after he won. So I went and got the briefings. And I went and I actually had people brief me who would have briefed in places where I thought were most interesting or most frightening. And you can't write a book about the whole federal government. It would be 60,000 pages long. But it is true that if you parachuted me into any agency of the federal government, I could find you a great story because of just how mismanaged it is. Mismanaged in this particular case. I mean, there's general problems that transcend the Trump administration, and the Trump administration is in many ways a symptom, not a cause, that they're a symptom of decades of trashing the federal government. So people actually believe that it's just like this pointless enterprise, where if it falls apart, you won't believe what's going to happen. The book is cherry picking what I think is the material that will be most interesting to readers who don't really know what goes on inside of the federal government. I'll be back to talk about it in 3 months.
Hi. So I'm about a quarter of the way through the Undoing project.
Mm-hmm.
So in looking at the cognitive biases that you talk about, how does that sort of what you've learned about that stuff sort of shed light on kind of your Moneyball and those ideas?
So I had a very funny experience, which is, I mean, it was unique in my writing career, that after Moneyball came out, there was a review I actually read. I tend not to read the reviews, and the review was by Dick Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and Cass Sunstein, who was in the Obama administration. He's a law professor at Harvard. And they basically said that I didn't understand the point of my story, that I thought it was about what I thought it was about. But what it was really about, in their view, was a case study in the wisdom of the work done by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, two Israeli psychologists who had explored how the human mind screws up when it's making intuitive judgments. Because what these baseball scouts had been doing that had led to the misvaluation of players was just using their intuitive judgment when there was actually a statistical answer at hand about whether this player was good or not good. And so that sent me scurrying to start to read the works of Kahneman and Tversky, who I'd never heard of before, even though the year I was working on Moneyball, Kahneman, a psychologist who knew no economics, won the Nobel Prize in economics for having changed the discipline from outside. So what subsequently the book I wrote about them kind of informed me after the fact, sort of the buckets that a psychologist would place the errors, the various errors that the baseball scouts were making. I think most of them were described one way or another in Moneyball, but in different language and with a different depth of understanding. That these people had gone out and kind of in a scientifically plausible way demonstrated that all human beings did, that it wasn't just baseball scouts. If you'd asked me when I was working on Moneyball, why is this happening? It's a question I should have asked, right? Like, why is the market making these mistakes? I didn't think baseball scouts were stupid. I really enjoyed the time I spent with baseball scouts. But I would have said there's kind of like a group think going on. Something like, it would have been kind of like peculiar to these people in some way, that it was so universal that that Kahneman and Tversky take all kinds of people and replicate exactly the same mistakes that baseball scouts were making across a range of human judgments. That was really interesting. And so the story ended up being, I mean, it kind of partly explains why Moneyball was as successful it was, because it was even more universal than I thought, the problems that they were dealing with.
And by the way, cognitive biases haven't exactly gone away, even in baseball. They're still out there. They're just different ones.
Right.
To a larger degree than they were 15, 16 years ago.
Right. And Kahneman and Tversky would have told you at the time that as amusing as it is to them to classify human idiocy, that them writing about it and classifying it isn't going to diminish it in any way. That they themselves, two of the smartest people walking around the planet, were amused by how even after they'd done all their work, they were susceptible to the same problems. We were wired to make certain kinds of mistakes.
So the smartest baseball people know that they're suffering from biases and they do what they can.
To not trust their judgment.
Right.
Right.
Got another question over here?
Thanks. Great talk. Billy Beane was one of those misvalued players in the other direction, and you get into it in the book. Why would he let you in, regardless of whether it's about him or not? Why would he let you in to the tribe?
You know, he didn't. He did it only reluctantly, and he did it. I can tell you exactly what happened. So I go start to inform the players in the clubhouse about how the lab experiment's going down, and so I start to get into the organization that way, and then I could come back to the front office and tell them things about their players that they didn't know. I mean, little things, but you know, how they were behaving, who was maybe smoking dope, that kind of stuff. And so I made myself somewhat useful to them, not hugely, but I wasn't just an annoyance. I wasn't just an annoying presence. I sometimes had things to say that they wanted to hear. And so he let me just loiter for a long time, to the point where they kind of forgot I wasn't part of the staff. And he said that since. He said, you know, we just started thinking he just kind of works here. But talking to Billy Beane about himself is not easy. He's very self-protective. And he did not have much interest in the psychology of Billy Beane. A lot of other people did, but he didn't. And the way I've found it's easiest to get people to tell you about themselves one way or the other is to do things with them. So I started to orchestrate things I would do with Billy. And one of the things I would do is I'd make him take me when he would go look at his minor league teams. So he would go drive to Sacramento or drive to Modesto from Oakland. And the drive home was always in the dark. And in the dark, he couldn't see that I had the notepad open and I was writing. But there was something about being alone in the dark where he would start talking to me in a way when I'd ask him questions about like why he got so angry when he struck out in the minor leagues, or why he thought his career hadn't gone the way it was. And he was more acute about his own self in those drives than he was any other time. And I got to the point where I thought, I mean, I could barely read what I'd written. The writing was all over the notepad, and I was turning pages because I wasn't sure I was writing over what I'd already written. And but I got to the point where I thought, I probably haven't gotten completely to the bottom of this. I probably won't, but I've got enough. And the enough was realizing that he was very, very aware that baseball had screwed up his life, that he had this other narrative, that he really should not have signed with the New York Mets. He really should have gone to Stanford and been the quarterback after John Elway. He probably would have played in the NFL as a free safety. He'd had a Stanford education. And as smart as Billy Beane is, and as on top of the world as he is, I mean, he's as on top of the world as any human being I know. He rules the world. He retains a charming intellectual insecurity that he didn't go to college. He eventually went back and got a degree, but that he didn't have a really deep, rich educational experience. He missed out on something, and he knows he missed out on it, and it really bothered him. So that once you know that about him, you know that part of what's going on here is a little bit of a revenge fantasy. That part of what's going on is they misvalued me and screwed up my life. I'm going to screw them up by figuring out how to do this properly.
But I should mention that Billy Beane isn't the only one who's opened up to Michael Lewis. You're the common denominator here. You've got a certain way of engaging with people, which you might not want to talk about at great length, but he's not the only one.
You try not to be tedious to be around. I mean, if you're not tedious to be around, eventually people are going to tell you who they are.
And a lot of people love to talk about their work.
Yeah.
If you want to start a conversation with a stranger, ask them about their work. And sometimes they'll be great. Sometimes they'll speak for 20 minutes and you'll be bored, but they will talk.
Yeah, it's true. True.
Do we have time for one more?
We can do one more.
Hi. As you said, baseball has changed so much, from Moneyball. Now we see everyone's data mining, right? So what's happening? What do you think is going to happen in the trajectory of sport now? And you're looking at esports and betting, all of these other issues. Do you think that the game will retain some of the integrity that it has right now?
It's funny. It's charming that you think that the game has retained integrity. I'm not sure integrity is what it's ever been selling. So I think, if we're talking about just baseball, but the professional sports generally, I don't worry that much about the integrity of the game, like, because gambling is now sports betting is now legalized, that everybody's going to be betting on the side. There's actually too much at stake for a kind of Black Sox kind of scandal now, I think, to happen. I mean, so that kind of thing doesn't worry me. The question is, 50 years from now, will anybody want to watch a baseball game? And that I don't know. I mean, I think it's so much of the appeal of the game is rooted in, and this is the thing that ended up, a lot of stuff that I ended up on the cutting room floor of the book I never wrote. And where I thought, there's rich material here. I just never figured out how to do it. And some of the richest material was to discover that even for players who were so battle-hardened and successful as the people who were drafted by the Oakland A's to play professional baseball, even those people were playing in ways that were rooted in their childhood experience. There was a player who could only hit left-handed pitching because his whole childhood he'd only seen left-handed pitching from an adopted father. He was great hitting left-handed pitching, and he just never got around to hitting right-handers in the same way. There was a player Mark Tian, who developed his swing in his backyard. He was a left-handed hitter, playing wiffle ball every day for years with his older brothers. And the left field fence was way short, and the right field fence was forever. So everything was the other way. He couldn't get it out of his swing in the big leagues. And the emotion of the sport is the same way. It's rooted in the experiences you had as a little kid, often with your parents, your dad, or with friends, playing the game. And your attachment to the sport later in life is echoing those feelings. Now, I look around me and I see little leagues that are, my son really wants to play basketball, despite being given every reason by me to play baseball. And I see that with a lot of kids. The game is just a little slow for them. It's out of step with the way they live their lives. And I say that's the risk to the game. That as long as you preserve that childhood, a vibrant little league, the game will be great, and people want to watch it. But if America's youth move on to another game, it's doomed.
Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.